So there's a new Evil Dead movie out and it looks pretty good. I want to go see it. The only problem is I haven't seen literally any of the ones before it, and the way that my brain works, I simply just can't do that. Even though this one looks to be kind of like a spin-off of some sorts, I know there's going to be some references to the previous films, and I absolutely detest being that guy who doesn't understand them. So being someone who doesn't know anything about this franchise at all, I'm going to watch all of these movies and the remake, give you my thoughts and opinions on them all before I go into how they all connect. If they connect, see, I'm not entirely sure. So if you're looking to catch up with this universe because it's been a long time, or just want to see a more brief summary of these films before the new one instead of watching them all like a psychopath like me, then I've got you covered. So we'll start with the first film in the Evil Dead franchise called The Evil Dead. I don't really know what to expect, I don't really know what to say to prepare you for this, so let's just get right into it. So this first film centers on a group of friends who go to a creepy cabin in the woods and unearth the Book of the Dead. Because these friends are in a horror movie, they accidentally unleash tons of evil spirits that possess the friends, leaving Bruce Campbell's Ash to fend them off and try to survive the night. While this might sound kind of cliche, I don't think it was when this film was first made in 1981, so I had to remind myself of that when I was watching the movie. So while it might be cliche by today's standards, the story of this film is actually pretty good. It's a gory survival horror movie, but it does a really good job with its world building and lore. They find some tapes in the basement and learn a bit of history about the demons, and it's small, but it's nice to know where they came from and why all of this is actually happening. Ash is really the only character to get any development at all, and while I haven't seen these movies, I do know that Ash is the main character for this trilogy, and this movie sets up a pretty interesting character arc for him. There's one point where he just stands there in shock as his friend Scott is fighting for his life, and by the end of the movie, Ash is, of course, fighting back. It's not much of a character arc, but it's something. The story is simple, but it gets the job done and leaves very little room for error and plot holes as far as horror movies go. Don't really know why they didn't just burn the book the moment that some bad shit started happening, but whatever, I'll move past that. So this movie is old. Noticeably old, but also kinda not given the look and feel of a lot of the modern horror movies. A lot of the cinematography and shot composition feels like it's something you'd see in a modern like A24 horror movie. You can see traces of how this movie influenced horror movies going forward, but also how it's still influencing them, making this genre kind of feel like history is repeating itself, and in this instance, it's not really a bad thing. That said, the editing is a bit strange, the music at times really brought me out of the moment, and the acting is a bit stiff, but judging this movie by today's standards is really unfair, so I'm not really going to mention it again. This movie was directed by Sam Raimi, and I obviously know his work from Spider-Man, and I had always heard of his iconic horror work, so I was excited to see that in full form for myself, and this movie does horror moments really well. The suspenseful moments are really well done, and the camera movements are unique and genuinely unsettling. As old as this movie is, it still actually is pretty scary. There's a few campy moments, and for a moment I thought it was because this movie is old, but they also seemed a bit intentional. And judging off my experiences with Sam Raimi's other works, I'm gonna assume it was indeed intentional because a lot of his stuff happens to be pretty intentionally campy. Will that continue going forward? I honestly have no idea, but this movie is through and through a horror film. The practical effects of the film are still really great. The gore is unsettling, and while they are aged effects, they still get the job done, making you feel a little queasy. This movie is NC-17, and I've literally never seen a movie with that rating before, and even though this is an older one, it still makes sense that it has this rating. This movie is probably gorier than any other movie I've ever seen. The movie is short, which is nice because it's not too over-bloated, but it also compromises the development of any character other than Ash. I learned that the girl locked in the basement was apparently Ash's sister, but I would have never known that had there not been a line of dialogue. Giving this movie a score isn't really fair considering I've never seen it before now and it's obviously very old, so on a scale of if burying your dead lover who's being possessed by demons is good and getting thrown into shelves all night long is bad, I give this movie a lock your possessed sister in the basement.
That's my rating. Figure it out.
So this is a movie that came out 6 years after the original, which itself didn't really seem like a movie that needed a sequel. Usually this is not a very good sign, but I'll look past that. Maybe I'm wrong this time around. Maybe this was a good sign back in the 80s. Evil Dead 2 is a sequel. I think it kind of rehashes everything that happened in the first film, but in the first 5 minutes. There's also changes, like the book isn't burned in the end, the cabin isn't completely destroyed, so it's like a recap of the first movie, but everything is also entirely different. Alright, I'll just keep moving on, maybe it'll get explained later. Right away, I noticed that the budget was greatly increased. It seems like they wanted to redo the beginning like how they would have wanted it in the first place, adding in some scenes with further context, like the people who actually own the cabin finding the Book of the Dead. Upon further research, I found out that they just didn't actually have the rights to the first movie to use the footage, so they reshot scenes in order for new audiences to understand what was going on. Camera movements and filming techniques are even better than they were in the first film. The point of view shot of the evil moving through the forest might be a little campy, but so is the rest of this movie, and I kinda like it. The decision to make this more of a comedy is so strange to me. The first one was a very dark and gruesome horror movie, but this one leans so much more into its campiness. I think the campiness and comedic moments take some of the more gruesome moments and make them a bit easier to digest, if that makes any sense. It also kind of does make sense given the story of Ash. We're seeing it all happen from his point of view, and as he slowly goes insane, the more funny and campy things happen. So it seems like everything that is funny and campy about this movie is actually happening because Ash is slowly going insane. Even though I think this movie mostly leans toward comedy, it still does the horror moments really well. There's the classic subversion of expectations and even jump scares that are all pretty well done. The story of this one is definitely more interesting than the first one. It doubles down on the story of where all these demons came from, showing us the daughter of the parents who owned the cabin and a subplot about how they found even more pages from the book, and I actually felt more invested in the overall story. Ash being this crazed person who can actually help the newcomers since he's experienced everything already makes for really interesting character dynamics. There's some foreshadowing to the next movie, Army of Darkness, so I'm hoping there will be some kind of connective tissue between this one and that one, because even in the end, this one is very confusing about its connections to the first film. The actual ending of the movie is really great. It sets up the third film, and we see the castle that we saw the parents exploring in the beginning of the film. That makes a return, and you obviously know that Ash is now displaced in time, and he's really scared by that. So overall, a really strong ending that wraps up the whole movie very nicely. In a lot of ways, this is a sequel, and then in a lot of ways, it also seems kind of like a remake. There's a lot of the same scenes from the first film, but then it is also continuing the story of Ash. So overall, Evil Dead 2 is just a pretty confusing title. I don't know, maybe there's something I'm missing or something I'm just not getting because this is my first go around with the franchise. If that's the case, I apologize to you, hardcore Evil Dead fans. Even with my confusion, I think that Ash really shines in this film. The story is better, and we get to see Ash become the chainsaw-wielding maniac that I've seen across all of pop culture for so many years, so to actually see that happen for myself was really cool. The horror is still good, even if it takes a back seat in this one. Some of the comedic moments work for me, but sometimes they don't. I think the action scenes work better for the most part, and I imagine I'll be seeing some more of those in the next film. So to rate this movie, if reshooting your entire movie in the first 5 minutes of the film is bad, and replacing your hand with a chainsaw is good, then I give this movie a rating of inanimate objects laughing at you until you go insane.
Figure it out.
We start this one off with another recap, this time voiceover, and at least some of the footage is reused from the last film, but the ending of the last film is once again played out completely different in the beginning scene. So right off the bat, even though the second film was also a comedy, this one is obviously so unlike the other two. I don't even think I need to explain why. Just look at the screen. But going into making this video, this was the one that I was the most excited to watch. I have a certain love for all movies of this time period, no matter how bad they might be, me, and this is certainly the Evil Dead movie that I've heard of the most, though I still don't think everybody actually knows that this is the third movie in a trilogy. Maybe you do if you're watching this, but this is so detached from the other two, and it is very easily just a film of its own. This movie feels so much like a Monty Python movie, and it's by far the campiest and funniest, and the story lends itself to the humor much more than the last one did. The humor, for the most part, lands with me. Some of the more juvenile slapstick scenes are kind of stupid, but they are intentional, and I'm sure that they were funny back in the day and still to some people now. There's still some horror present, but it takes much more of a backseat to the action and the comedy this time around. However different this film might be compared to the first two, there are some signature traits from the first two Evil Dead films. There's the point of view shot of the evil, a lot of the makeup design is the same for the Deadites, some of the world building rules still apply, but other than that, this is a completely different film. Ash is more of an action hero with one-liners than he is a crazy person. He's more akin to Han Solo than anything he was in the first two films, and it's really funny to compare Ash from this film to the first one. For the most part, this is your pretty standard hero's journey adventure story. Ash is the chosen one with the really strong and unique weapon. He unites the warring people to stand and fight against the army of the dead. Wait a minute, Ash is just Jon Snow, or Jon Snow is just Ash. In terms of your typical fantasy action movie, this is pretty good. In terms of ending this trilogy, it's a little unorthodox, and I'm sure the opinion of everybody can change depending on your preference, but I certainly enjoyed it. So giving this movie a rating, well, I feel like this is probably the one that has aged the best out of them all. So sure, some of the effects are outdated, but all the costumes are great, the practical effects are still really good, and the ending battle is genuinely enjoyable, and I'd probably watch this movie again. So I'll give this movie like a 7 out of 10. Overall, this has to be the single strangest trilogy of films ever put to screen. You have the first entry, a dark and gruesome horror movie that's rated NC-17. The second film that's still a lot like the first, but this time around is more of a comedy. And a third movie that has time travel and is set in medieval times. There is not a single trilogy of films that covers more ground and genres than Evil Dead does. This trilogy today would be like if there was a sequel to Midsummer, but it was about Florence Pugh becoming the leader of this cult, and it was a comedy, and then in the third film, she goes back in time to create the cult in the first place, but she has to face off against something like dinosaurs. So overall, a very strange trilogy. I liked each individual film, but due to my own personal biases, I think I'd like Army of Darkness the best. So going from watching the older horror movies to a modern one is really jarring, but nowhere near as jarring as going from Army of Darkness to the unrated version of the 2013 Evil Dead. The prologue is very different from anything we've seen in the franchise, and going into this movie I was wondering if it was just going to be a complete reboot with all the same characters, but it's not, and it doesn't have a recasted Ash, so I was excited to see the differences, what they were going to keep, what they were going to do differently, and really how gory this movie was going to be overall. It certainly has some of the more modern horror movie tropes, but it also takes time to develop a good story and a good reason for all these kids to be here, along with giving each of them some development and dynamics that would be explored throughout the film. This was a nice change of pace from the original version where there was very little character development for anybody other than Ash. The story is actually really good. They're all on a retreat so that Mia can detox cold turkey, and they decide that no matter what she says, they're gonna keep her there, so when she starts saying crazy things about demons and the forest, they think that she's just going through withdrawals. This sets up some pretty great moments because as an audience, we know what she's saying is true, but we also recognize how crazy it would sound to the others at the cabin. There's also the bona fide idiot who, after reading through an evil witchcraft book they find in a basement filled with dead animals that says don't read the book, he goes out of his way to read the book. So characters doing stupid things in a horror movie? Check. Dog dies a horrible death? Check. The only black person in the movie dies first. Check. Like I said, all the makings of a modern horror movie. But being a modern horror movie means the effects are greatly improved, and they certainly are. This movie uses all practical effects, which makes the scenes that much more horrifying, and these effects look so great, this movie doesn't really seem like one that's 10 years old. With the addition of actual character development comes an actual message for the film, and that's what addiction does to your friends and family. How your own addiction might affect you, but it affects all of those around you as well. It's a little half-baked. The movie definitely isn't focused on delivering a message, it's focused on being a gross and terrifying film. There's tons of references to the previous movies, but my favorite is how they kept the point of view shot of the evil moving through the forest, and that was probably the most iconic thing that I picked out of the first 3 films, so I'm glad that they kept that in. There's the road being covered in water instead of a bridge being out. 2 different characters' hands either get cut off or infected, similar to Ash. David gives Mia a sort of similar looking locket that Ash gives to his girlfriend. And you see, these are the things that I just need to know when watching a movie in a franchise. I also really like that they try to burn the book, but it won't burn in this one, and that was one of my issues with the original Evil Dead, so it must have been a pretty common problem that they addressed here. There's also evidence that this movie does take place in the same universe as the original films, but more on that in a bit. Now, maybe it's because I watched the unrated version, but this movie is genuinely horrific. As I'm writing this, I really don't know how I'm gonna edit this video because so much of this movie is way too graphic to show on YouTube. You know what? Most of this franchise has been really graphic. This is going to be a nightmare to edit. But other than its sheer brutality, the horror aspects are really well done. There's great moments of subversion and edge of your seats thrills, and while this is the lowest rated movie in the franchise, 6.5 ain't bad. I weirdly think that for a movie that's only an hour and a half long, it feels a bit too long. It feels like there's 2 different third acts, and I think that's because when this movie starts its horrific moments, it doesn't let up from the gas until the credits roll. So I think it was just a little bit fatiguing. Also, the stuff from the prologue of the movie never actually comes back into play again. I figured that was leading to something big for the third act, but none of these people ever come back in the movie. So overall, that was just a little bit strange. I don't know if it was because there was a planned sequel to this movie and they were going to be in that movie, but as of right now, it makes the film feel a lot less well-rounded than the original. There's also a post-credit scene that, I don't know, doesn't add anything to the movie at all. And then there's another one of Ash saying groovy. That was nice. I think that this movie paid tribute to the original in a really great way while also making it its own thing entirely. As far as remakes go, this is certainly one of the better ones that I've seen. I think a 6.5 is a really fair rating, so I'll keep that and use it as my own. Alright, I'm all caught up on the Evil Dead franchise. Time to go out and watch the new one. I'll come back and do the review then. Well, I guess for you, that's right now. So I was correct in my thought process. I needed to watch the other movies to understand the references, not really the story, but there are a lot of references that fans of the series will instantly recognize and really like, and those are the kinds of things that I wanted to see. So obviously this movie is still in theaters, which means I can't exactly use any of the footage, and I don't want to use the same promo pictures or the trailer during this segment, so just enjoy some gameplay from Evil Dead the game. But this film does a really great job of separating itself from all the other films. Some of the rules of the last films don't apply here. There's no burying the dead, setting them on fire, or even dismembering them. Apparently the evil just never dies in this one, which allows for some gruesome kills that exceed dismemberment. If you haven't seen the movie, I'll leave that to your imagination. Some of these changes I really like, but others make me question a lot of the lore in this universe, but again, I'll get to that in a bit. The prologue of this film is very disconnected from the rest of the film, and at first I thought that it was going to be another Evil Dead 2013 scenario when the prologue just never connects anything, but it actually does come full circle in the end in a pretty clever way. But hands down, the standout aspect of this film is the setting. Evil Dead has always shown us very horrific situations, but they've mostly all been about a cabin in the woods. You don't go into a cabin in the woods, odds are you must be safe. But this movie is set in the city and really makes you feel unsafe no matter where you are. This setting offers a lot of new opportunities for the story, and in some ways they take advantage of these aspects, but it also seems like they were afraid of straying too far from the Evil Dead formula. This does have the same step-by-step process that the other Evil Dead films have. not necessarily Army of Darkness, but the other ones. The characters and performances by the actors are all really great. The first act of this film is very tame and allows some room for development before anything crazy starts happening, and I really liked this in comparison to 2013's Evil Dead. While they are very similar tonally, Evil Dead 2013 steps on the pedal about 20 minutes into the movie and never lets off the gas. I think this film took another like 10 minutes to develop characters before anything too gruesome happens, so by the end of the film it didn't feel as exhausting. I will say I was surprised in some moments of this film because a lot of the characters are children, so I didn't think that this movie would really go there in the violence aspect, but it certainly does go there, and it does so very unapologetically. Outside of Army of Darkness, this is certainly the most unique Evil Dead film, and I thought it was pretty great. 7.5 out of 10. Alright, that's all the movies, so the real question is how all of these films connect. While there are 3 films that are considered a trilogy, the ways in which they connect is not as concrete as some of the other trilogies are. So in this explanation, I'm going to skip over a few things just to make them seem a bit clearer. There's also the remake and the new Evil Dead Rise. Are these two connected in any way? I'm going to go through the story of this entire franchise, talk a bit about the lore and the characters, and what the future of this franchise might hold. If you're wondering what film is on screen, just look up right here and I'll tell you. So a group of friends travel to a remote cabin in the woods in Tennessee. Scott, Cheryl, Linda, Shelley, and Ash. When the group discovers a basement in the cabin, Scott and Ash search it and find several interesting items. A strange-looking book, a strange-looking dagger, a tape recorder, and a double-barrel shotgun. The group listens to the tape, which contains some diary entries from Professor Raymond Knowby about the book they found called the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, roughly translated to the Book of the Dead. By listening to Professor Knowby's recordings where he transcribes the book, it awakens the spirits around the cabin known as Deadites. The Deadites possess and torment the friends, leaving only Ash alive by the morning. Ash attempts to destroy the book by burning it, but it doesn't seem to work, and Ash continues to get attacked by the evil in the woods. He runs from it and returns to the cabin, though by all accounts, Ash seems to be losing his mind. His hand gets infected by the evil, and he's forced to cut it off. Meanwhile, Professor Knowby's daughter, Annie, returns from a trip with the lost pages of the Book of the Dead. With the help of her research partner and some locals, Annie returns to her father's cabin, but doesn't find her parents. Instead, she finds Ash. Thinking that he's killed her parents, Annie tries to attack Ash and force some answers out of him, but this group soon finds out that Ash is their best hope at surviving the onslaught of Deadites. Ash and Annie talk about the pages of the Necronomicon, about a prophecy of a hero to lead people against the Deadites in 1300 AD. The Deadites continue attacking, and Ash replaces his severed hand with a chainsaw, becoming a complete and total killing machine. Ash and Annie hatch a plan to send the evil away by reciting another incantation from the book, which works, kinda, but Annie is killed by Ash's severed hand in the process, and the incantation opens up a portal, sucking Ash in and sending him back to 1300 AD. He kills a Deadite, and he's hailed a hero, Ash realizing that the prophecy he saw from the book is actually about him. But not everybody is totally sold on Ash. Lord Arthur mistakes Ash as one of Henry the Red's men, so he's sentenced to the Pit. The Pit is a literal pit with a Deadite inside, but Ash takes it out and escapes the pit. Threatening anybody who gets in his way, Ash is determined to get back to his own time and goes on a quest to retrieve the Necronomicon. Along the way, Ash has an encounter with tons of tiny versions of himself until one of them gets inside of him and grows into another full-sized version. Ash defeats the evil version of himself and goes to retrieve the book. He's stumped when he arrives and he finds 3 different versions of the Necronomicon. He figures out which one is the one that would help him return to his time, and he takes it. He was supposed to recite an incantation to retrieve the book without alerting any spirits, but Ash says it wrong, so the army of the dead raises from the ground, including evil Ash, who becomes the army's leader. Ash returns to Lord Arthur's castle, and using his knowledge from present day, conjures a plan to survive the attack of Deadites. He fights off evil Ash and unites the Warren clans before drinking a potion that would allow him to sleep off the remaining time until he awakens in present day. He returns home, resuming his job at the local S-Mart. But what about the 2 other Necronomicons he found? Years later, a different family now owns the Nobi cabin, and a different group of friends goes there in order to help Mia get over her addiction to drugs. One of these friends, named Eric, finds one of these different Necronomicons in the cabin, reading it aloud when the new writing in the book clearly states that he shouldn't, and the Deadites return to wreak havoc once again. Mia insists that they should leave after her encounter with the evil, but her friends and brother chalk it up to her just having withdrawals. However, they soon learn that she was right, and they should leave because the Deadites start attacking and picking off the friends one by one. Mia's brother, David, is successful in his attempt to rid the demon from his sister's body, but gets killed by another Deadite soon after, leaving it up to Mia to be the lone survivor and face the ultimate demon from this book, the Taker of Souls. Mia survives the attack and takes out the Taker of Souls and leaves the cabin. Now for the other book, that's where Evil Dead Rise comes in. The book is stored in an old underground bank vault. An earthquake shakes the ground free, and a family comes in contact with the book, unleashing the evil in an apartment building in California. While some members of the family make it out, the evil possesses a different person who goes on a trip to that's right, you guessed it, remote cabin in the woods. So there's a few things I want to go over. First and foremost, the books. So the way I see it, each book has its own set of rules, and we see that on full display across each of the films. The book from the Evil Dead trilogy tells us that the Deadites can be killed one way, and that's bodily dismemberment. This makes weapons like the chainsaw and the shotgun that Ash uses incredibly effective. The book from the remake of Evil Dead is pretty forgiving, giving you an additional 2 options to dispose of the Deadites: burial and fire. And the book from Evil Dead Rise is the most unforgiving, saying that none of these options work and your best bet is to just try and run. So the most evil version of this book is probably the one from Evil Dead Rise, and the least evil version is the one from the Evil Dead remake. Not to say that I'd want one situation over the other after watching these films. If I am ever in a remote cabin for some reason, I will not be doing any reading whatsoever. Each of these books appear in all of the films in one way or another. Yes, they all look different, but that's because over the years there's new pages added and new binding methods. By who? Well, that's a really great question. I think this could be really interesting territory for a hypothetical sequel. Who are these people that add in new pages and make new covers for the Necronomicons? What happened to Mia? What happened to the survivors of the family from Evil Dead Rise? Can all 3 books be destroyed once and for all? Are there more books? I think there's plenty of room for more sequels, but I can also see why they take their time with this franchise. Whatever comes next, I'll be watching. So that completes my journey with the Evil Dead. Wait a minute, what's this? Okay, I don't have time for this right now. I'll save this for another video if you guys want to see it. Throughout the many horror franchises out there, it seems that there's always a false note somewhere. There's always a movie that is clearly not that great, maybe even a string of movies before a reboot that's actually good, and even the sequels from the reboot aren't that good. But Evil Dead separates itself from all other horror franchises in that regard. Like I said earlier, the lowest rated movie in this series is the Evil Dead remake with a 6.5, and most horror movies, whether they're related to a franchise or not, are not rated even this highly. When your worst film is a 6.5, you've probably got a good series on your hands. All of these movies are treated with immense respect to the franchise and the lore, and I think that's because Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell are very careful with this franchise. They don't just want a simple cash grab, they want something that will genuinely shock and scare the audience, or in their films make them laugh, and they've achieved whatever they've set out to do each and every time. It's very refreshing to see producers who have such a deep love for the world and the characters over the potential for more money. I'm really glad that I watched these films. I still think I might have missed the hype train that many fans have for this franchise that makes this series have a very special place in their heart, but it was a series that I had never seen myself. I've seen so many different references on social media or just pop culture in general, and now I get to say I know exactly what they mean because I made this video. I'm sure there's going to be some hardcore Evil Dead fans watching this, and if I had watched these films a long time ago, I could totally see myself falling in love with these movies. I'm not saying that I don't like them, they're all very solid films. regardless of the genre, and I stand by my statement that the Evil Dead trilogy is the strangest trilogy I've ever seen. But what are your thoughts on the Evil Dead? Are you excited for another possible entry in the franchise? Let me know down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.